What happened to your high school bully? In high school, Jake wasn't just any bully. He was the kind of guy who had an entire school walking on eggshells. He didn't need to throw punches or push people around. No, he was much smarter than that. Jake had a knack for picking you apart with words, for finding that one thing you were insecure about and making sure everyone knew. Whether it was mocking the way I dressed, the way I answered in class, or even something as personal as my family, he never missed an opportunity to make you feel like you didn't belong. For years, I dreaded running into him. I'd change my route between classes, eat lunch in empty corners just to avoid the sting of his words. It wasn't just me, either. There were a lot of us. He somehow always stayed untouchable. Teachers didn't notice his subtle torment, and no one dared to stand up to him. It felt like Jake had life all figured out while the rest of us were just surviving it. Then graduation came, and I thought I'd never see him again. I moved on, or at least I tried to. But the weight of his words, they stuck with me. I imagined him somewhere, probably doing great. Maybe the same smug guy, but with a higher paycheck. Fast forward a few years, and I found myself back in town for a friend's party. It was one of those random get-togethers where you catch up with people from high school, half of whom you didn't even really like but were curious about anyway. As we sat around trading stories, someone brought up Jake. And let me tell you, what I heard wasn't what I expected. Apparently, Jake's life had taken a turn. A bad one. He didn't go to college, couldn't hold down a job, and got into some trouble. Fights, run-ins with the law, you name it. Everyone had heard bits and pieces, but the general consensus was that Jake was no longer the king of anything. He was barely getting by. And then, like a ghost from the past, Jake walked into the party. But he wasn't the Jake I remembered. The guy who once strutted through the halls like he owned the place now looked lost. He was thinner, worn out, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He wasn't surrounded by friends, and there was no swagger in his step. Instead, he quietly slipped into a corner by himself, nursing a beer like it was the only friend he had left. I couldn't believe it. This was Jake, the guy who could tear people down with just a look? I watched him for a while, trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I worked up the courage to ask someone who'd stayed in town what happened. And the stories? They were rough. After high school, Jake's life spiraled out of control. He bounced from one dead-end job to another, had issues with addiction, and burned bridges with most of his old friends. The confident, sharp-tongued guy I once feared was now just a shell. At some point during the night, our eyes met. For a brief second, I braced myself, expecting a sarcastic remark or maybe that infamous smirk. But instead, Jake just looked at me. His expression was hard to read. Not angry, not mocking, just empty. And then, he gave me the slightest nod, like he knew exactly who I was, and maybe even regretted everything he'd done back in those days. It was almost like an apology, a quiet acknowledgement of all the years of pain he caused. And in that moment, I felt something unexpected. Pity. The guy who once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was now struggling with a life that had clearly chewed him up and spat him out. The satisfaction I thought I'd feel wasn't there. All I could think was how small he looked now, not just physically, but emotionally. I realized something that night. Sometimes life catches up to people in ways we can't imagine. Jake, the bully who once seemed to have it all, was now paying the price for all the damage he'd done. Not to others, but to himself. He was living his own worst nightmare, and no one else had to lift a finger. It was a strange kind of closure. I didn't need to confront him, yell at him, or demand an apology. Life had already done that for me. So, what about you? Did your high school bully get what they deserved, or did they turn things around? I'm curious to hear how others' stories played out, because for me, seeing Jake like that was a reminder that sometimes karma works in ways you never expect.